as I arrived yesterday afternoon. I want to talk to you about the Prime Minister, his authority or her authority or its absence, and I want to do so by comparing and contrasting their position as Chief Executive in a parliamentary system to the President, the United States President, who is a Chief Executive in a presidential system. These are chalk and cheese. You can eat one and you can write with cheese, and it's a very different position. And I want to kind of compare and contrast. Andrew rightly said that one of the ways in which political science, or those interested in politics, try to make sense of our world is by comparing and contrasting. And looking at the Chief Executive in the United States and comparing him or her to the Chief Executive in Britain is an interesting way of doing so. To start off, I just want to mention something very obvious to you, which is the 3 qualifications David Cameron has to be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the present time. This is not that he has charm, elegance, intelligence, wit. It is that he has 3 qualifications. The first is that he is a Member of Parliament, elected for Whitney in 2001, re-elected in 2005 and re-elected in 2010. That's the first qualification he has. There are 60 million of us resident in the United Kingdom. None of us can be Prime Minister unless we are one of the 650 members who sit in the House of Commons. David Cameron is one of those. The second qualification he has to be Prime Minister is a party leader. There are presently 8 parties represented in the House of Commons, so there are only 8 candidates for Prime Minister. He is a candidate because he has the party leader since 2005, and he's led the Tories in those 8 years since. And he led the Tories into the general election in 2010 when he fought against Labour led by Brown, and if anyone remembers him, think about Gordon Brown these days, and Nick Clegg, who led the Liberal Democrats. The third qualification he has is that he is the party leader who is able to command the majority in the House of Commons. Rather unusually, he is a party leader who can only command the majority in the House of Commons by virtue of being in coalition with the third place party of the Liberal Democrats, because in the last election produced a hung parliament in which no party had a majority. Makes the description much more complicated, but he has a parliamentary majority. Tony Blair became Prime Minister because he was a Member of Parliament for Sedgefield, first elected in '83, elected throughout. He was elected Labour Party leader in July 1994, and on May the 1st, 1997, he commanded a Labour majority of 179 seats in the House of Commons. So those are the 3 qualifications a Prime Minister has, and any one of those goes, they cease instantaneously to be Prime Minister. And what I want to bring to your attention, again I said I was stating the bleeding obvious, so to speak, is that the Prime Minister is a parliamentary creature. The principal thing is being an MP, being a party leader in Parliament and commanding a parliamentary majority. Barack Obama, the present United States President, has several qualifications to be President. The first is, under the written fixed constitution that has been spoken about, is he's over the age of 35. The second qualification is that he is born in Kenya. No, I'm joking, of course, he was born in Hawaii. You have to be born in the United States to be president. Just think how brilliantly minded those founding fathers were in order to design a system to exclude Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was born in Austria, or Henry Kissinger, or even my good self, born in England. The third qualification he has is that in the competitive election in 2008 and 2012, he commanded a majority of the Electoral College, whereby each 50 states cast ballots, and apportioned by population, you win a majority of the Electoral College. And the final thing that he can serve for only 2 terms, and he can not be re-elected to a 3rd term because the Constitution prevents him from doing so. The first thing Barack Obama did on becoming president, well, after saying, gee whiz, isn't that great? Thank you, folks, and let's engage in this hopey-changey business of which he spoke about so eloquently and so often. The first thing he did to become president was, being a sitting United States Senator from Illinois, elected in 2004, he had to resign from the United States Senate in order to qualify to be president. Separation of powers means that the chief executive cannot sit in the legislature, in the Congress, and if he does, as Kennedy did, as Barack Obama did, they have to vacate their seat in order to take up the presidency when they're sworn in at 12 o'clock on the 20th of 20th of January to begin their term. So the separation of powers creates the space for the President to govern. The fusion of powers in Britain's parliamentary system creates the authority of the Prime Minister to govern. So they're very different. Often we'll speak about presidentialisation as a kind of metaphor to try to understand the form and function of the British Prime Minister. I want to talk about that in my comments, but it is an anomaly to compare the two by saying they are similar. They are very, very different political beasts, much in the way that a cat, last time I checked, having flunked biology, is different from a dog. They do different things even if they have fur and 4 legs. So if we think about the British Prime Minister, he is, as the old saying has, primus inter pares, and my Latin, I remember, tells me that's first amongst equals. He is a parliamentary figure sitting within an executive. There is, of course, a contemporary obsession with political leaders and a common belief amongst both politicians and the public that leaders matter. We focus on the Prime Minister more than we do on other political figures. He or she is the chief diplomat, the principal politician. Of course, the United States President is the head of state and has a lot of advantages by virtue of that fact. The British Prime Minister is merely the head of the government, the Queen being head of state, but increasingly we invest the Prime Minister with greater attention, with a greater focus. He is probably the most important political figure, even if they are less powerful than we sometimes believe. And of course this owes much to the personal style of leadership that is pursued by Tony Blair and by Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher used to go into cabinet and say, I have no time to argue with you now, all I can do is tell you what I think and have my way. If you look at the speeches as I've done of Cameron or of Blair, you will see that they use the personal pronoun more than anything. They don't say, we the government will do things. I, the Prime Minister, intend to try. We focus on the Prime Minister because of their personal leadership style and our belief. And we often now increasingly cast votes at elections because we like leaders or we dislike them. And most famously, at the last election, we had a Prime Ministerial debate between the 3 candidates, even though none of us had ever cast a vote. None of you have yet cast a vote, perhaps, but when you cast a vote, you vote for your local MP. You vote indirectly to elect a Prime Minister who emerges from Parliament, doesn't get elected by the people, which of course is a very different position in the United States, where you cast a ballot for a name in whichever state you live. Political parties now are less effective than they used to be. They're dominated by their leaders in a way they weren't previously, and leaderships matter. Ed Miliband is the most important person in the Labour Party. He's not the only person in the Labour Party, but he's probably the most important person. He can lead the Labour Party even if he can't command the Labour Party. The same for Clegg and the same for Cameron. And finally, or predominantly, there is this notion of personalisation refueled by the news media, which enlarges and magnifies the Prime Minister, it stretches him or her away from their party, makes them more significant, makes them the figure that we focus on, whether we like them or we don't like them, whether we think them strong or weak, good or bad. And my argument, of course, is modern politics enhances the power of the Prime Minister, but crucially it can also diminish it. Being centre stage means you get all of the credit when things go well, and you get all of the blame when things go wrong. Harry Truman famously had a sign made for him, put on the Oval Office desk, the buck stops here. And the buck does stop with it stops with the Prime Minister, much more incidentally, in my opinion, than it does with the President, because the President says, I can't do anything because Congress won't let me, I can't do anything because the states won't let me. Prime Minister is only Prime Minister because he commands a majority in Parliament. And historically, the Prime Minister and his parliamentary colleagues in the Cabinet are able to lead the House of Commons and the House of Lords in ways which sometimes amounts to being able to temporarily command it. Understanding the role, I'm not going to this, Prime Minister is President or head of a Prime Ministerial government. You've all noticed Prime Minister, what's power? Does the Prime Minister have all the power? Does the Cabinet have all the power? A debate which is now tired and circular. I agree with my old friend George Jones, who says that the Prime Minister is perhaps ultimately only as strong as his party and particularly his chief colleagues within the cabinet permitted. Very different, of course, from commanding a single-party government, as did Blair, as did Brown, as did Thatcher, as did Major, as did everybody since 1945, and commanding a coalition government with a Deputy Prime Minister not of your choosing, beyond your control, in the way that Cameron finds himself restricted by Blair. I'm going to rush through this because I just don't want to quote myself. It's in the handout that Kathy prepared for you. So essentially, in terms of the Prime Minister, his or her political influence in Britain is a movable feast. The degree of authority he or she enjoys within the executive is subject to significant change. Sometimes they can be powerful in the executive, other times they can be less powerful. And secondly, dominance over their party majority within the legislature. Obama has no party majority in the United States House of Representatives, in which there's a Republican majority. He has a Democrat majority in the Senate, but that doesn't help him very much. If we turn our mind back to Bill Clinton, coming, I think, to Belfast next week, Clinton was first elected in 1992 at a time when, separately to him, the United States people elected a Democrat majority in the House of Representatives and a Democrat majority in the United States Senate. For the first 2 years of Clinton's 8-year presidency, he worked with a Democratic Congress. In the midterms of 1994, the Republicans took the House and the Republicans took the Senate. And for 6 years of Clinton's time of office, he had no party majority in the United States Congress. And this was a problem for him in terms of governing, in terms of pursuing his agenda. But frankly, if you look at Clinton's record as Prime President, his biggest electoral, his biggest political setback, his biggest legislative defeat came on healthcare reform, Matt mentioned it, in 1993, when a Democrat-run Senate threw out his and Hillary's proposals to reform healthcare. A Democrat Congress denied a Democrat president a key part of their political program. This is what happens with the separation of powers, where Congress looks not to the president or their party leader, because they don't have party leaders in the United States. There's no party leader. No one elects the leader of the Democratic Party. There isn't a position or of the Republicans. The Prime Minister, as a party leader, is guaranteed leadership of his party majority, which is very much the case when you have a single-party government, much more complicated when you have a coalition government. Institution imperatives determine these power resources. The United States President commands their executive. They dominate their executive. It is their executive. We call it the Obama administration. When the CIA discovered that they thought they had found Osama bin Laden living in Abbotsford in Pakistan, they reported to the president. They said, we think we've got him, about 80% certain it's him. He's living in this big house, and we want to bring that to your attention. So the president, Barack Obama, organised a meeting of his principals, got them all together and said, what do we do? And some said, let's wait and see if it is him. Some said, let's drop a big bomb on the house and kill him and destroy it to bits. Others said, let's go in and extract him and kill him so we know we've got him. They all presented different opinions, different views, different arguments. The president decided. He went away, thought about it, and decided that he would send in the SEALs to kill him and extract his body and prove to the world that he was gone. President is, as George Bush said, decided because he dominates his executive. But he is not guaranteed any supply within his legislature in terms of his or her policy agenda, irrespective of whether he has a party majority or not. Prime Minister is guaranteed, because of his partisan majority, supply within the House of Commons, which of course in our asymmetrical bicameral system is by far the most important part of the British legislature. The Prime Minister, however, works with and through colleagues within the executive. Tony Blair, we all said Tony Blair was a very, very powerful figure, and he was a very authoritative Prime Minister. He had many ambitions as Prime Minister. One ambition was to enter the euro. He had to overcome the triple lock, which is a majority in the cabinet, a majority in Parliament, and a majority of the British Citizens voted in a referendum, but he was stymied from even pursuing that agenda because Gordon Brown, his Chancellor, was not in favour of joining the Euro. And of course, as we know, eventually Tony Blair was removed from office by Gordon Brown and his supporters who wished to get rid of him and replace him by Gordon. So the simple thing to understand about prime ministerial power, very different from the president's power, is that prime ministerial influence begins with the executive's domination of the legislature, even under a coalition government. Andrew spoke about the British House of Commons, I don't want to say, but just to make my point, British House of Commons has two functions. The first is to supply and support the government. First thing it does is it creates the government, produces the Prime Minister, not by vote, but by osmosis. We know the elections won, Labour had a majority when all the ballots were cast in 1997, Major went out and Blair came in. And the Labour majority of 179 supplied Blair and then supported him. The second function the British House of Commons has to do is to check and balance the government, to hold it to account, to question its actions, to oppose its policy. What we know as a result of partisanship in the United Kingdom is that the government majority, particularly when it's a single-party government, that majority will prefer to supply and support the government rather than check and balance it. And this partisanship allows the government to govern. In the 320-odd, 3,200-odd parliamentary votes cast in the 10 years of Blair's premiership, Labour lost 4 votes, which is a pretty good strike record. In the United States, the legislature, the Congress, has no business. It doesn't supply and support the executive, which emerges independently. It certainly checks and balances it. And this is what makes the president weaker within the Congress, and this is what makes the Prime Minister and his executive stronger within Parliament. So if the prospect begins with the executive's domination of the legislature, the opportunity for prime ministerial influence is determined by the Prime Minister's ability to exercise influence within the executive. The executive is a collegial executive surrounded by colleagues, all of whom have an independence of the Prime Minister, some of whom, of course, have more independence than the other. Essentially speaking, everybody within the cabinet can replace the Prime Minister. When Thatcher fell, her Chancellor, John Major, succeeded. When Blair jumped because he didn't want to be pushed by Brown, Brown succeeded. And Cameron is pretty secure this side of the election because of the nature of party politics at the moment. So Prime Ministers are aware that they can be dispatched at a moment's notice. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair had numerous run-ins. You may recall, during those 10 years of Labour government, on one occasion they had a huge row because Brown was expecting Blair to vacate the leadership and the premiership to allow him, Brown, to succeed. And on one occasion they had a famous row in which I will not give the actual quote that Brown said because I'm aware I'm a Methodist institution, but to put it at its most simplest, he said, "When will you go away and engage in sexual intercourse whilst leaving the room? And let me have your sexual intercourse job." You can perhaps, it may be beyond you to work out the actual Brown quote. And Blair eventually did vacate the premiership for fear of being fired and removed from office. Now, nobody in the United States executive can do that to the president. In fact, the idea that the Treasury Secretary would be so discourteous is never going to happen. When Hillary was Secretary of State, she would have had to kill Obama, kill the Vice President, Joe Biden, kill the Speaker of the House, kill the President pro tempore of the Senate, the longest serving member of the Senate, in order to succeed. And I suspect the FBI would have noticed her doing this, so she couldn't ever hope to succeed. The only person who can succeed the President if he resigns, if he's impeached, or removed by act of God, or somebody firing from a window from a book depository, in downtown Dallas, allegedly, or standing on a grassy knoll. You may have your own preference as to what happened that long time ago. The Vice President will succeed. Very different politics. I think I've more or less mentioned this. I'm going backwards, aren't I? No. Yeah, well, I've more or less covered this, I think, in my combination. Yeah, again, this is all in the handout. I hope it's pretty much. So good, I'm verbose on occasion, aren't I? I missed something. There is something I'm looking for. Here we go. This is why the myth of presidentialization is very interesting. They're totally different characters. I want to reinforce this point to you before concluding. Prime Minister cannot be a president, despite many political scientists argue that he or she should be considered a president. Michael Foley is a very good student of political leadership, has written a famous book called The British Presidency. Paul Webb, a friend of mine, and his colleague have published a similar article. I take a very different view. I think the Prime Minister is way more powerful than the President, for these reasons. First of all, the President is located, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, within a federal state with a limited government. The Prime Minister operates in a unitary state with an unlimited government. And this makes all the difference to the Prime Minister's power compared to the President. The President cannot, for example, remove from the American citizens their right to bear arms. It requires a constitutional amendment to be mentioned. You need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states to vote to deny him that power. The British Prime Minister, with the support of Parliament, can do that immediately, overnight, and has done so in the past. There was a terrible terrible act of mass murder in Dunblane in the 90s, and Parliament, led by Prime Minister John Major, tightened up the laws on gun control considerably. Prime Minister has no control over how states run their education systems. He can provide some carrot and stick by financial resource, but he can't instruct them. In the United Kingdom, we have a national curriculum written by a minister and by a department official. So in a federal state, you're weaker. With a limited government, you're weaker. As has been mentioned, the British-American Constitution exists to stop government doing things. As Jerry Ford, not a philosopher, but President of the United States, said, a government that is big enough to give you what you want is strong enough to take away what you have. And that's the way the American political culture approaches political activity. The President is directly elected, the Prime Minister indirectly elected. This makes them very different. Although I would argue, and I do accept, that personalisation and mediatisation of political processes mean that we now invest greater attention in prime ministerial candidates than we do in parties generally. Greater attention is paid to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland than to other actors within the devolved administration. The President is separate from and autonomous of the United States legislature. Prime Minister is drawn from and accountable to the British legislature. This is a very important distinction. Prime Ministers can, as Andrew mentioned, be fired. They rarely are, but the threat is ever present. No president can be removed other than by being impeached by for committing high crimes and misdemeanors, or lying to their wives about having affairs with interns, as happened with Bill Clinton in 1998. And no president has been impeached. Andrew Johnson survived by 1 vote in 1868. Clinton survived by 32 votes in 1998. And Richard Nixon would have been impeached. He had 5 votes in the United States Congress, in the Senate in 1974, but he resigned. He jumped before he was pushed. But still, impeachment didn't happen. He resigned rather than was removed. Mrs. Thatcher has been alluded to. She was removed by a vote of her own party, and Blair was forced to resign. It's a great threat. It means that the House of Commons can remove you or at least your own side of the House of Commons. The opposition in the House of Commons do nothing but heckle and shout and propose alternatives. It's a process of checking and balancing, but it doesn't affect the Prime Minister of the day. His cabinet are on side and his parliamentary majority is solid. The next one is that the President is not the leader of his or her party. There's no party leader, which doesn't give the Prime Minister, President, any authority. He can't, if an alien landed in America and said, rather unusually, take me to your party leader, you'd be at a loss to know what to do. Well, first of all, you'd probably run or get that bazooka that was shown earlier in order to deal with the alien, rather than talk about political science to him, or her, or it. We're pretty unsure about the gender of any alien that arrives. I, for one, ain't hanging around to find out. I'm just leaving if an alien presents itself in my vicinity fairly quickly. There is no leader of the Democratic or Republican Party. Cameron is the leader of the Tory Party. Miliband is the leader of the Labour Party. And finally, the President is the head of a personalised executive and the Prime Minister the head of a collegial executive. This makes all the difference, in that they are master of their domain, as I've already said, within the executive, but they are weak within the legislature. So, prime ministerial powers then are a result of movable feasts. I want to find another slide. So Prime Ministers then have an institutional power resource. This is a little model of mine of Prime Ministerial leadership, which I'd like to share with you, because if I don't big up my model, who will? Yes? Prime Minister has legitimate authority and prestige. It's a big thing to be Prime Minister. There aren't many of them. As Harold Macmillan said, no Greek nor Roman was ever British Prime Minister. Even though they're not the head of state, so they are not accorded the respect that presidents are, they are still legitimate and they're prestigious. And they're usually, without exceptions, even including Gordon, fairly able politicians of the first rank. They're the legal head of the government. They have the crown prerogatives. And they're involved in all matters, directly or indirectly, in government policy. Everybody consults with them, yes? Mrs. Thatcher used to be said of Mrs. Thatcher, she was like a traffic light. She went green, meant the government ministers could go and do things. Red, they couldn't do things. Now, of course, they can't govern the entire country by themselves. They have to delegate. They have to take a... it's preferably when you've got no opponent, yes? Those are the best fights to have. I assume that's class bell, yes? Yeah, I assumed it was. I thought it was like a short fire, the fire we put out. That made me worry. Very, very proficient fire service here. Prime Ministers set the policy agenda. And the Prime Minister has an administrative reach, which is very small, of course. 1,000 people working down the street. 10,000 people work in and around the White House, yes? The Prime Minister doesn't have a valet or cook, and doesn't have his own Air Force plane. Blair wanted to have his own plane for the Prime Minister and dropped the idea when everybody said they would call it Blair Force One. But he has administrative means across government. He's able to access knowledge and expertise. He's able to have people report to him. Prime Minister, however, has personal power resources, because some Prime Ministers are more powerful than others, yes? It's a movable feast. Let me put them all up. Prime Ministers are more powerful than when they know what they want to do, when they have an objective, and they have people on side and they pursue it. Whether it's a good objective or a bad objective, it doesn't matter. If you know where you're going, it's easier to drive a car. They have reputation, skill and ability, even Gordon. Some have more skill than others, yes? Gordon had very few presentational skills, very bright and able politician that he was. Personally he was bad on TV, he looked funny. Peculiar, of course, not amusing. But the two biggest resources a Prime Minister has is whether they're associated with actual or anticipated political success, or whether they have public popularity and a high standing in their party. The more electorally popular you are, the more powerful you are. The more successful you are, the more powerful you are. And you can trace, as I've done, Blair's strength within government according to the way in which his popularity fell. He kind of lost political capital. Enoch Powell, who you can sometimes quote, famously said that all political careers, unless ended at some happy mid-juncture, end in failure. The only Prime Minister to leave Downing Street happy and under his own speed was Harold Wilson in 1976, when he resigned, surprisingly, of his own volition, and for the last 40 years or so we've been saying, why did he resign? What was going on? What did he know? Was he a spy? All these other things. Everybody else ended in disaster. Thatcher was fired, Major lost the general election, Blair jumped before he was pushed, Brown was fired, and Cameron can only be Prime Minister with Nick Clegg breathing down his neck. I haven't spoken too much about the problems relating to coalition government, but I want to end on this story to reinforce my point. The only Prime Minister, in my opinion, who has been a president is David Cameron, because he lacks a command within the House of Commons, because the Liberals have a veto. David Cameron did the most presidential thing any British Prime Minister has ever done 2 years ago, when he gave a speech on welfare reform. And he said, all the things I want to do, this is what we should do about welfare reform. And he said, these are the things I will do if I am Prime Minister of a single-party Conservative government, indicating that he was powerless to act in regard to that reform because Nick Clegg would veto it, because the 4 other members in the Cabinet would not permit it, because the Quad, comprising 2 Tories, 2 Liberals, would not allow it, and because the Parliament would not vote for it. Prime Ministers are rarely as weak as this Prime Minister, who is a Prime Minister of a coalition government, because coalition government empowers the executive by disempowering a party majority, because there is no party majority. And we wait to see what happens at the next election. Anything can happen, to see what next Prime Minister we get and whatever power they have. But if they are in and they have these personal power resources, they'll be able to make greater use of these institutional power resources that come with the job. And it means that Prime Ministers are ultimately creatures of their parliamentary system. And the political culture that's produced that Andrew spoke about, and presidents, very different chief executives, are a product of a political system which restricts their power, limits their authority, and allows Congress to deny them the ability to pass legislation, which is a raison d'etre of the powers of the British Prime Minister and the British Cabinet. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was in any way.
Now, this is what's called dangerous. This is where it is over to you. Nothing happens, nothing's said unless you ask questions. By the way, teachers are allowed to ask questions. You don't have to, but you are allowed to. Can I just, before we start, could I just ask by way of a sort of presentation, a little thank you, before we forget, could I call upon Sarah, Maddie and Hannah to come up to the platform. And these gentlemen, I hope, have informed you, entertained you, educated you this morning, and as a little token of our thanks, the girls would just like to present them with something which is slightly political as well. Rightly or wrongly, I've been asked to be the sort of the convener of this. Very poor man's Mark Crothers. Something like that. Okay, so the first question, please. So any questions from the floor? Put your hand up. There's one at the back from St Dominic's. Make your way down, Hannah. Hannah has never used a roving mic before. She's a very skilled musician, so I'm sure she'll manage. You could just give us your name as well.
My name is Abby.
Abby, could you stand, Abby?
Looking at the cases of Roe versus Wade and Ward versus Board of Education, how far would you agree that politicians hide behind the Constitution and the decision-making is left up to the Supreme Court?
Right, who would like to take that? that really for you, Matthew? Would you like to? Yeah, well, of course you need to probably do. Is that okay? Sorry.
Am I right? The essence of the question is to what extent. Wow, okay, that can be awkward. Bad way to end the day. Am I right in thinking that the question is sort of to what extent politicians hide behind the Constitution and the sort of the Supreme Court decisions? They do to a certain extent. It depends how popular or unpopular the Supreme Court decision is. When the Supreme Court ruled that flag burning was actually constitutional, George Bush Sr., the smarter one of the pair, came out and said, you know, this decision is absolutely plain wrong, and he's quite happy to challenge the Supreme Court on it. But on something like abortion, which, depending where you go in the country, is a much more divisive subject, most politicians have either hidden behind the Supreme Court and said, look, you know, that's the Supreme Court, it is not a matter for the executive, or they've, called up Amendment 10 of the Constitution and said this is a states' rights issue, I don't want to get involved. Okay, I left it as a funding issue. It does depend. What you've had with Obama, which I find slightly alarming, is over Obamacare, one of the very first examples of this, is Obama actually criticised or trying to influence, maybe the right word, the Supreme Court before they'd actually made the decision. You know, they were debating Obamacare, whether it was constitutional, whether the direct mandate was constitutional or not, and he stood up and said it would be unthinkable for them to strike down something passed by a big majority of the US Congress. Now, first of all, it wasn't passed by a big majority of the US Congress, I don't think. Secondly, really, I think it's quite a dangerous precedent in terms of, you know, him criticising the Supreme Court, criticising before that, because normally with the Supreme Court, they are somewhat reliant on the executive to actually carry out what they say. So, for instance, when they say, we're going to desegregate Brown versus the Board of Education, they can't go there and say to the schools, right, we're doing this, or else we're going to come around and beat you up. They're reliant on the states and the federal government to actually do something about it. And we brought out Brown versus the Board of Education. They didn't say you're going to do it with orderly speed. And the state government actually did it with as least speed as possible. So, I think, I've rambled a bit there, I think Presidents do hide behind the Supreme Court when it suits them to do it. When it's a Supreme Court decision that they like, they're quite happy to stand up there and say, yeah, this is the right decision. It depends on the issue, I think. Hopefully, does that answer the problem? Cheers, thank you.
We move for any questions. Another question, please. No. Yes. Daniel, I think it's called Daniel. That's very important if you're going to be a politician, always name check. Remember Nick Clegg? He was very good at remembering it. Thank you, Daniel. Your question, please.
With the founding fathers being made up in terms of demographics, mainly of the landed property owners and those of a rich background, could it ever be expected that the American Constitution would result in a system which would be different from the one which is at present, in which more people from a black background go to jail and college?
Who would like to take that? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. We're on the Constitution. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that founding fathers were the colonial elite. If you look at the people who came up in Philadelphia, 55 of them in total, I think 42 of them were lawyers or had a lawyer's background. There were people who kind of broke the law. If you look at Alexander Hamilton, actually he couldn't be president, he was actually born out in the West Indies. There's a rumour going around for a long time that George Washington visited the West Indies and actually George Washington was his father, which is absolutely not true as far as I'm concerned. But he came from a very, very poor background. George Washington actually came from a very, very poor background. He was one of the few founding fathers who had been to university. He was very, very sceptical about what's the word I'm looking here? He was kind of sceptical about the learned elite. You know, because he'd been out at a very, very young age. At 19, he'd been out surveying the American wilderness. And as a result of that, he was the one who was sort of saying he only served 2 terms in office. Partly because he had this idea of, power tends to corrupt, powerful men are often bad men, not always, but often. Benjamin Franklin took a similar view, John Adams took a similar view to a certain extent. I think, it's a system like that, which is fundamentally undemocratic, which they set up, a system which they created to suit themselves. If you look at the issue of slavery, Jefferson was quite happy to stand there and say, slavery is a great moral ill. When he wrote a question about the State of Virginia, he said, I tremble when I think that God's will is just and will eventually be visited upon all of us. And yet, at the same time, they're quite happy to say, we don't want to keep slaves. It's a practical issue. Jefferson said it's like holding a horse by the ears. You don't like holding a horse by the ears, you bloody well don't want to let go of it at the same time. Whereupon George Washington did free his slaves, but mainly for economic reasons, because he actually did a time emotional study and said actually slaves are rubbish. They don't work very hard. And actually it's much cheaper, you have to look after them when they're ill, you can get rid of them, you can get and hire people instead. But I've rambled again. But yeah, I think the founding fathers, I think there is a problem because it was set up by elites, and to a certain extent for the benefit of the elites. It wasn't until the 1840s that you got someone like Andrew Jackson coming in. And again, there are a lot of comments about Andrew Jackson, deeply unpleasant man, racist and lunatic. But you see the expansion of American democracy for people from a poor background.
Richard's well meant answer that.
I'm not an American specialist, but if Mr. Franklin, when asked what have you got, a Democrat or a Republic, he said a Republic if you can keep it. Well, they have kept it, but they've also improved it. Martin Luther King spoke in the March on Washington about the promissory notes that had been given to African Americans. A promissory note is where you say you'll do something, you don't do it. There's a note saying that you will do it. But the Republic, in improving itself, has tried to get to grips with these great issues, and they're still on an onward journey. And if the Republic was made by slave owners, it's now led, its chief executive, its head of state, is a man of African American descent. So it's in progress, yes. Although it's a fixed constitution, it has changed dramatically over time because the founding fathers never provided for a Supreme Court review. That was provided by the Supreme Court itself in a wonderful example of politics in action. So even if they were all bad people, all white men, and Madison was a short, tall man, we shouldn't hold it against them. They were products of their time. And actually, I think they produced the most marvellous political system, despite the problems of gridlock and deadlock. And it's no accident that the superpower emerged there.
Yep, okay, can we, any more questions? Right in the back, yes? You just let us know your name.
Power is a difficult thing, because if you are asked, would you prefer to be the United States President or the United Kingdom Prime Minister, you'd probably vote to be the United States President, yeah? You get a bigger house, you get a jet, you get a big car, you get a bigger salary, it's a more important thing, you travel widely. So I think you need to make a comparison within their respective political system, yes? And my contention, there are people who would challenge this. Mistaken people take a different view. The Prime Minister, being Chief Executive of presidential of a parliamentary system, if politically popular and electorally successful, will be much more powerful. If we take the question relating to the first answer on abortion rights, I nearly moved again, the President has no say on whether they're on the issue of abortion in the United States. He has none. He may indirectly influence, as Republicans try to do, and Democrats, by making Supreme Court nominations subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. When the British House of Commons, under a Labour majority in 1967, legalised abortion in England, Scotland and Wales, as I understand it, or just England and Wales, excuse me, they simply did so by an act of Parliament. And nobody could overturn that act of Parliament other than Parliament. So if you command a parliamentary majority, support a parliamentary majority, if, as I said already, the partisan majority prefers to supply and support the government, not check and balance it, then you can have a significant purchase over the politics of the country you're chief executive of. The President has no say on abortion politics. The Prime Minister is a member of Parliament. dominating a legislature that is reactive, as Andrew said, not proactive. The British House of Commons can't substitute its own legislation for that presented by the government, even led by a coalition. It's a much more powerful job to have, but it's a smaller job. You don't get the car, you don't get the house, you don't get the name. Nobody called Mrs. Thatcher in America because they call her Prime Minister Thatcher, because the title is lost once you vacate the office. In the United States, you get libraries and museums, and you're feted. And that doesn't happen to prime ministers because they're not heads of state. They even get to pardon Thanksgiving turkeys. Yes, you'll see the occasion because they're head of state. They don't get heckled, they don't get shouted at, they get treated with respect in the way that prime ministers don't. But power in their own system, prime minister infinitely more powerful than the president, provided he has the command of the cabinet and provided he or she has the support of the parliament, which they usually do because it comes with the job.
So a couple of things to that. One is that you should always remember that it's the rules of the game inside this, and also the context. The rules of the game in America are decided by a formally written constitution that is very hard to change. And so the role of the president is a very small role to begin with. It's always been the states that have dominated, and still powerful states control Congress. If you put together when the Democrats controlled Florida, New York, Texas, and California, they control those. And that's just mathematics. California has something like 30 electoral votes, Florida, a high number of New York, Texas, and so forth. So they control America. It doesn't matter what the president wants. He or she can't force it through. This idea of the powerful president really only began in the 1930s when Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the power of the office to force through changes to get America out of depression. And then America went into the Second World War. He became a war president. A lot of the early things he tried to put into place were overturned by the Supreme Court, so he battled with the Supreme Court. He found it very hard to get constitutional changes, other than the very first one he did, which was to end prohibition. And every president since then has been a figurehead, and that's why they're important. They're head of state and head of government. And as Richard said, the British Prime Minister is only head of government. But what powers they have when they have a majority and they control Parliament and they control their party. Tony Blair changed the British Constitution in ways that are still only working their way through. He abolished the role of the House of Lords in terms of being the highest court of appeal. With one simple, small parliamentary act, he established a Supreme Court. He didn't even consult the judges when he did that. Brought in the Human Rights Act and actually got a judge to write that, which has changed fundamentally the way the public sector in the United Kingdom works. So in terms of actual power, the most powerful prime ministers we've had in recent years have been Mrs. Thatcher and Tony Blair, because they've had big parliamentary majorities that have allowed them to change the constitution to suit them. That's being tailored now and curtailed by the grand powers of the European Union, and that's still a fight to be fought through and worked out.
Possibly three more questions. Yeah, over here. Just about halfway out now. Okay, just let us know your name. By the way, is the sound working? No. That's good, doesn't matter. We all know each other. Sounds well. You may have to take this down if the lights working.
I'm John Blue, and what would your thoughts say on Britain having a constitution, and do you think it would benefit Britain or if we didn't have one?
Does it depend who wrote it? No. I mean, the problematic way of doing it, and constitutions change only because of either social revolution or defeat in war and political collapse. So the French have had 5 constitutions since they decapitated their king. Some years after we did so, French are always behind the curve. And each time when the old order was broken, they had to write a new one. The United States, having dismantled their association with us, had to form a more perfect union, and they did so by writing down rules and regulations. So we've never been defeated in war, we've never been subject to foreign occupation, and we haven't had a social revolution since the 17th century. So it's very hard to see that we would ever codify our constitution. We may do so by stealth. We have the Human Rights Act now, which provides a degree of judicial review unheard of before 1999. The great thing about the British Constitution, I think, is it's flexible, it's fluid, it's organic, it's always changing. Sometimes not so well, sometimes to good effect. But you could never codify it because, first of all, who would appoint the committee, who would then report to the committee, and of course the House of Commons is stymied on Lord's reform, having pursued stage 1 Lord's reform by abolishing hereditaries in 1999, a short-term measure. 15 years later, we're still no near a second stage because the House of Commons can't agree on what type of House of Lords it wants. Do you want a more powerful or a less powerful one? Do you want it elected or partially elected or appointed? All sorts of huge political questions. So you could never codify the Constitution unless we had a defeated war or Armageddon took place and we had to start from scratch. At the moment, we just improve what we have. Sometimes we do it well, as in fixed-term parliaments, although it should be 4 years, not 5, in my opinion, as a citizen. And sometimes we do it badly, as in the case, being as a citizen, as the Human Rights Act provides a degree of judicial review unnecessary and alien to British political tradition.
We're back live again. Sorry, your kids.
I don't personally support the codifying the Constitution in terms of talking to an American friend of mine about this a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, oh, if you had the Constitution, it would protect all of your rights. And as we sort of talk about today, every single sort of right the Constitution was meant to be set up for has at some point been ignored or overreached by the US government, and then having a Constitution has not protected them from their government from spying on them or intercepting their emails. I think yesterday it's intercepting their Yahoo web chat cameras. Our government doing exactly the same thing. So the idea that us having a Constitution to save us from that, I think that's not accurate. Let's talk about it.
Right, time for one, possibly one or two more questions. There's, unless you'll get through. Yes, young lady here from. It's actually it's working again. So yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay, you sorry.
You were talking about the Prime Minister having more power in the establishment that I would like to ask what you think in terms of foreign policy, with obviously the President having executive orders and signing statements. Would you agree that the President would be more powerful in terms of foreign policy?
A very interesting question. I think the one job that's got weaker over the last 40 years is our Foreign Secretary. Foreign Secretary used to be one of the big officers of state with the Home Secretary and the Chancellor. But that position has been devalued now because increasingly Prime Ministers are their own Foreign Secretary. They're their own chief diplomat. They can travel, they negotiate, they go around the world, face-to-face encounters. So the Prime Minister is pretty much in charge of foreign policy, provided he has the support of the Cabinet. But incidentally now, of course, Tony Blair, an autocratic Prime Minister, somebody wanted to lead the Commons by the nose from the front, by providing for a parliamentary vote on the intervention in Iraq in March 2003, has set a precedent that now, if you wish to intervene militarily, you need the support of the House of Commons. And Cameron was defeated on intervening in Syria by a common vote, the first time since the 1840s. So in terms of the executive power to wage war is now weaker than it was previously, largely because politically we're objective to the way in which Blair went to war 5 times. Not everyone, but some people. So, but again, it goes back to the question at the back in terms of making a comparison. Presidents, even weaker, are more powerful globally than they are if the Prime Ministers are, even if they're powerful, because Britain punches little under its weight, considering we're an offshore island of 60 million souls compared to a behemoth like the United States. But I do think Prime Ministers are foreign affairs in one way or the other authority. One of the reasons Blair became interested in foreign affairs, because Blair never made a speech in opposition about international matters. And Peter Adamson once said, doesn't Tony do war? And we know that he did. One of the reasons he wanted to remake the world was not just because of his reaction to 9/11, because he didn't have to deal with Gordon Brown telling him what to do and limiting his powers. So prime ministers tend to get involved in international affairs because they can't do much at home, and they are powerful, but they're not powerful because they represent Britain in a way that the president is powerful because they represent the United States.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'm good with that point.
Yeah, that's good.
Is the increased use of executive order right to the Constitution and undermines the legislative function of Congress?
Yeah, it's a simple and short answer to that. The spread of executive orders over. Can you hear me, by the way?
Big one?
Oh, you can't. Is that better? Yeah, the short answer to your question. Okay. I know the short answer to your question is, yeah, I think executive orders are problematic and are undermining the Constitution. And I think the reason that so many presidents have gotten away with it so far is that either people aren't fully aware of them, Congress haven't necessarily called attention to them enough, or the fact that they simply haven't been troubled enough by the Supreme Court. And there was a big discussion last November when Congress was discussing the idea of immigration reform, and about the idea that we've got all these illegal immigrants running around the place. And Marco Rubio, who may or may not be a contender in 2016, actually said, look, this is really killing us. All these Hispanics ought to be Republicans, but they're not. We ought to legalise them. And one of the arguments he put forward as well as this is saying, if we don't, then theoretically President Obama might be able to do this by executive order. He might take 10 million or so illegal immigrants and legalise them via the power of executive order. And the thing is, I read around this at the time and various people put their views forward for the New York Times, Washington Post, is no one was really 100% sure whether he could or not. And this is one of the great things about the US Constitution, is it is so vague, so few things have been tested out. I mean, most presidents would still argue that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Everyone fought the Line Item Veto Act back in 1994. Yeah, everyone thought that was constitutional until the Supreme Court said it wasn't. So I think executive orders are potentially very, very dangerous given the circumstances, and I think it's something the Supreme Court ought to look into in a lot more detail.
Time for a final question, and it has to be the wonderful blazer at the front. If you can come forward.
Hello, my name is Jason Quinnis. Now, that there stole the question, so I'm going to reword it. On the topic of Congress versus Commons, which is more effective, if you take into consideration how good committees are in America compared to how weak they are in the UK, and contrast that with the fact that the UK Commons have demonstrated the power in war, as in Syria and Iraq, against Laos and Cambodia of the US President, and the fact Congress didn't even know about it. What would you say is more effective, considering the factors?
The example you give of Laos and Cambodia is a good one, because it's precisely that illegal war that led to the War Powers Act straight after. And so you had a whole series of things occur between 74 and 79, 80, where Congress grabbed back its power. And what you had was a very powerful president from, actually Kennedy was very weak, but Johnson was very powerful, and then Nixon was too. And they overplayed their hand, and they did exercise all kinds of powers illegally, as it was found. And Congress passed a whole series of acts, of which the War Powers is the most famous. But they limited, they clipped the wings of the president, and it began to go back into balance with Reagan in 1980 to 88. But so you had powerful presidents, and then you had an overwhelmingly powerful Congress, and they did a lot of that through committees. But again, they reformed the committees. You used to have a seniority system. You still essentially got it, part of that. But it meant if you were the oldest person there, you'd served the longest time, you became chair of a committee, and you'd work your way up through powerful committees. The so-called Watergate babes got rid of all of that. They just changed the system, and they changed the committee system, so you had a different kind of committee occurring. In the UK throughout those years, you had an executive-dominated committee system that wasn't very effective in terms of holding the executive to account. It was very good at going through bills. Then you've got the Public Accounts Committee, beefed up powers, a new series of committees brought in through the Blair government, of which Margaret Hodges chaired the Public Administration Committee is shining. The point is, and I've given evidence to one of these committees, you think, oh, this is wonderful, we're going to change the world. And then what they do is they make a report, and then the minister just says, don't care, I'm getting through with a vote. With the coalition, that's slightly more difficult. But again, it's a different system, it's different rules, different context. Congress organised itself in the Public Committee system because that was the most effective way to do it, and that also took into account the so-called iron triangles, the role of money. You can never underestimate the role of money for driving through American programs. And the politicians look at who votes. And if you look at who votes mostly in America, it's if you're white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you're in work and you're earning above the national average, your voting likelihood is to be well over 70%. If you're poor, Hispanic, even if you're a citizen or African American, your likelihood of voting can in some places be under 20%. So the politicians go to where the money is and where the votes are. And Britain's electoral system, Britain's politicians looking at the way the electoral system works are becoming increasingly sophisticated too. They look at where the votes are, who votes, who's got money. So the system is becoming not Americanized, it can't, because it's a different system. But it's reflecting some elements in that the British can take on board.
I think it's one of these things where probably a lot of people think of questions now, or think of questions as you leave. I'm sure that the three speakers at the front will be too happy by email. If there's any questions you have, that we can send them forward to you. I just also, we always do sort of evaluate funds at the end of this kind of thing. But we're not going to do that. I just would like you, obviously probably an indication by your interest and your engagement through the three speakers. If you maybe again to show your appreciation for them, that would probably be also, I can subscribe that's slightly quirky, but one thing I'd like to just do to finish, if it's okay, if I could ask you all in a moment or two, and a bit of mixing's required here, if you could all perhaps just come up to sort of the front, in front of the stage, and the speakers can stand behind, and if I could ask whoever's got the camera, whoever that is, that's Sarah, she could go up to the balcony and we could just have one last large photo. There's one other little thing I need you to do, because staff are coming in here in a moment. If you could please make sure you lift everything in your area. You're responsible for your property, a strong American notion, and if you just come up to the front